Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, before we get into the conversation proper, it is important to bring to light the 66-page report presented by Beacon Consulting Limited. The report is a review of security occurrences in Nigeria in the month of September 2024, highlighting the socio-economic, political, and environmental issues that led to them. This includes mass killings and kidnapping for ransom by non-state armed groups, criminal gangs, cult groups and armed ethnic militias, and pockets of social unrest in the form of protest and labor action triggered by harsh socioeconomic circumstances in the country. Again, according to this humongous report, other events were the arraignment of the August protesters and the rhetoric for a planned protest on October 1st. Who else can better break down the content of this report except the CEO of Beacon Consulting Limited? He joins me virtually. Dr. Adamu, good evening to you, sir. Thank you so much for coming on Politics Tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Good evening.
Good evening to you. So since our last conversation, a lot has happened. Some successes have been achieved in this fight against banditry, especially in the Northwest. Alilu Sububu and some other kingpins have been killed after security chiefs relocated to Sokoto State. In your assessment, where are we?
Frankly, nowhere. And I say this with all sense of responsibility. You can only measure your success if you have a strategy in place. And that strategy gives you an indication of what your success indicators are likely to be. And I'm sorry to say that I haven't seen that strategy. Like we've mentioned in the report, and just like you've also mentioned in your introduction, there have been military successes. In security terms, we call it a decapitation strategy, where the leadership of armed groups are being, chased and either arrested or killed. And at the last count, over 30 of such significant leaders have been killed. If you expand it, we can even say up to about 80 of such leaders, that's if you include that of the terrorist groups and then the bandit groups, have been killed. But the question is, within what framework, within what strategy is this being done that would now allow you to say success is being done? If you now also put together, just like we've done in the report, the number of persons that are being killed, and so that our listeners kind of get what I'm trying to say, we documented in the month of September 1,022 deaths in Nigeria. So yes, this decapitation strategy is being pursued. The leadership are being killed. But unfortunately, Nigerians are also being killed. And in particular in northern Nigeria, when we did the regional breakdown of this figure, of the 1,022 persons that were killed, 77% of the abducted persons were in the northwest of the country. I repeat, 77%. And this is where the military leadership were requested by the president to redeploy. This is where the Minister of State for Defense has been visiting over the last period. Yet we're seeing 77% of the number of abducted persons, which was 807 within the month of September. And then for the other regions, for Northeast, we recorded 10.41% of this 807. And then for the North Central, we recorded 8.3%. If you add all of these three together, it means almost about 90% of the abduction incident affected the northern part of the country. Only about 10% were recorded in the southern half of the country. The same thing if we go to fatalities. 40.7% of the fatalities affected the northwest of the country. 32.8% affected the northeast of the country. And then 13.21% affected the north central part of the country. Again, if you add them up, they represent over 90% of the figure for the country affecting the northern part of the country. And I would say again, this is where the president has given a directive. This is where the military is deployed. This is where they are killing the leadership of this bandit and terrorist groups. Yet we're seeing these huge numbers. So that absence of a grand strategy that would identify the sources of weapons, that would identify how they are recruiting new members, that would identify how they are still able to get fuel for their motorbikes, that would also identify how they're even able to access those motorbikes, that they will identify how they're able to collect ransom when they abduct individuals. And then I would also identify how their ammunition or their weapons is being brought into the country. The absence of that strategy, unfortunately, is the reason why we're seeing these numbers as high as they are at the moment. And then, of course, perhaps in the course of our conversation, we can also speak about the inability to get the buy-in of the people. At the end of the day, the success of any counter insurgency or any anti-banditry campaign is dependent on how the government and the law enforcement and security agencies are able to get the buy-in of the people. And at the moment, unfortunately, there is still a huge gap there. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing these huge numbers at the moment.
Absolutely, Dr. Adamu. So I see that this report encompasses Nigeria risk barometer, high-risk impact areas, density distribution of abductions and fatalities in Nigeria. But how much impact did the August protest have on insecurity in the north? That protest was marked by violent clashes, vandalism, and looting, particularly in the north, leading to heavy-handed security responses, including military interventions. In your 66-page report on that, what were your findings?
So we were able to document killings by mainly gunshots during the protest. What we were not able to determine was who shot those guns, because as we've already documented in the report, there are weapons that are in the hands of different players. Of course, the Nigerian security forces, the military, the police, and several others do have weapons, and they were deployed during that period. But we also know that non-state actors, different types, also had access to weapons, and those weapons were used during that protest. So we don't know who actually did the killing, but we documented over 30 deaths associated with the protest during that.
So how did you come about the numbers, Dr. Adamu? How did you come about the numbers? So
our collection capabilities is one that is of global standard. We use different methods to collect our, quote unquote, information, which we now turn into intelligence. It's a combination of open source and human sources. Human sources is a range from security agencies themselves to people like you, journalists, to others who are domiciled in this society, who have access to this type of information. So we collect all of this, verify it, and then put it together into some meaningful form. Again, it's a global standard, and it's what we have embedded into our practice to produce this type of result. With regards to your question over the consequence of the protest, there are a couple of issues that have emerged. Number one is the civic space. There is an increasing perception that the civic space is being constricted. A lot of the feedback that we got, especially from the civil society organizations, is that that attempt to suppress what some of them felt was a legitimate protest has resulted in the constriction of the civil space. If you also talk to the security agencies, which we did, they were concerned that such a protest could deteriorate and lead to anarchy. And so they deployed actively in an attempt to prevent that protest from becoming a situation of anarchy. Of course, some of the indicators of foreign influence was also something that we documented. Russian flags were being waved. Polish students from Poland were arrested during the protest, even though the circumstances of their involvement and their arrest is well documented. The effect of social media in terms of what happened in Niger Republic and the populism that the junta there pursued and its influence in the northern states, we also documented that. And then, of course, the disparity in the protest between certain locations in the country, and of course, some of the locations where we saw more involvement of youth and civil society organizations, and then also the responses of our security forces to the protest. In certain instances, the responses were highly commendable. Then, unfortunately, in certain instances, we documented human rights abuses by the security forces. At the end of the day, I think the question that really emerged is the credibility of the state in terms of managing dissent. That is one question that I think has remained, and that unfortunately is yet to be addressed.
Also, because that document reported that on a regional level, 3 regions were impacted. The Northwest region, which accounted for 56.67% of fatalities, the North Central region, 23.33%, and the Northeast region, 20%. But looking back at that to that protest and the way it turned out, you would agree with me that it brought about some conversations begging for answers, especially questions about the disappointing scenes from the northern part of the country. You just talked about foreign flags were flown within Nigeria's sovereignty, which was condemned across board. But does this also speak to perhaps the division and disparity in ideology within the political class in the north?
So there are so many factors, and just like we've documented in our report, we've tried to divide them into 4 parts. The socioeconomic issues, poverty, illiteracy, unemployment, the existence of groups that some will describe as hooligans. There are different terminologies that are being used to describe those youths. They exist in certain parts of the north. Groups that either cult groups or gangs that in one way or the other were engaged and involved. And that brings me to the next point, which is the political component. Some politicians saw the protest as an avenue and as an opportunity to exact influence, negative influence, I must say. And so they mobilized these groups, including the cult, the gangs, and some of the criminal groups. And in some instances, even possibly armed them. And we saw that. The next component is the economic component. The cost of living crisis created an incentive, as it were, for certain persons to take advantage. So you saw warehouses. A good example is Jigawa, where warehouses were raided and the contents of those warehouses were stolen by the protesters. And I think a few other locations, including some parts of Bauchi State, where we saw that. In Kano State, we saw public infrastructure. I mean, for me, the most ridiculous was a traffic light that one of these young persons was attempting to remove. And I think I also saw on social media, we couldn't verify that, where a certain traffic light was stolen, and then the guy actually connected it in his room, and he was using it. So, things like that were an example of the breakdown of law and order, and the fact that the economic circumstance in the country could have triggered those type of occurrences. And then the weakness of the security arrangement. At the end of the day, public security is really about deterrence. It's really about ensuring that law-abiding citizens like you and I are able to carry out their businesses as long as it's legal and lawful, without the consequences of illegal activities like what I've just described. And that failed, unfortunately, during the 10 days. Our constituency, the company that I run, which is Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited, we provide risk management advice to companies. And I can tell you that during that period, a significant number of business operations were either reduced or were shut down. Supply chains were disrupted. Companies like Dangote and the other big ones, BOA, that would supply materials, either in terms of the raw materials they needed or the finished products that they would supply across the country, were disrupted during that period for about 10 days. If you calculate the impact of that, banks were shut down during that period. As a result, they were managing their risk, because if they open, they could be targeted and their staff could also be targeted. So they naturally either reduced or shut down their operations. So all of that were quote unquote economic consequences of the protest.
But there was a part of, Dr. Adamu, there was a part of that document where you thought the security agencies should have handled things differently.
Definitely. There is a whole lot of material on what is called policing 2.0 protest, modern protest, in other words. And policing 2.0 protest or 2.0 protest requires a different approach. For the simple reason that the mobilization that we used to know in traditional terms is not the mobilization that occurs in 2.0 protest. So the number one rule for policing 2.0 protest is really about engagement. What we saw in this instance, the engagement came very late. You would engage on the basis of intelligence. By the time you engage, you would have gathered intelligence. You know the leadership of the protesters. You know their modus operandi. And then you also know their intention. And the intention can be varied There is the latent intention, there is the manifest intention. So intelligence would tell you both. And when you are engaging, you are engaging on the basis of strength. Unfortunately, we didn't see that. In the case of that August protest, the engagement came just a few days. And it was an engagement that was, if you allow me to say with all sense of responsibility, that was done without that level of intelligence. When you engage and you are discussing with the other side.
Dr. Adamu, could you be specific, please?
The Inspector General of Police, as an example, engaged with the protesters. But the kind of language that we saw was not a language that was driven by knowledge, by intelligence. It was more around saying, don't protest in this location, come up with your leadership. So if intelligence was already available, the leadership would have been known. It was pointless at that stage asking for the leadership to emerge. It is expected that the entire security gamut in Nigeria already has knowledge of the leadership of those protesters. So when you engage at that point, it's really to tell them this is what you want. Look, we know you are going to protest. We're going to give you the protection that you need. This is the route that you are going to follow. This is the kind of deployment we are going to do to ensure that your protest is protected. And this is the do's and don'ts, quote and unquote, that we wouldn't want to see when you are protesting. If you intend to deliver a letter, where are you going to deliver that letter? What do you need from us? So that's the kind of engagement that I would have expected. We saw it in certain locations. I must commend the then Commissioner of Police in Rivers State, to an extent the Commissioner of Police in Lagos State. I think they managed the protest, as it were, slightly better than we saw in other locations. What happened in Abuja for me was a huge embarrassment. It could have been done better. We saw instances of heavy-handedness. We saw journalists being molested. We saw civil society activists being molested in the Federal Capital Territory. All of this, for me, were necessary. If we had done our work as a country with our 29 security departments, if they had come together and done their work and gathered intelligence using technology, I must emphasize this, because most of the mobilization happened within the cyberspace. If they had done their intelligence gathering in the manner that made them conscious of the fact that this is a two-point-net protest, it's not your traditional protest, and they had gathered the intelligence, perhaps the approach would have been better. One of the things that I'm hoping has been done, I don't know if it was done, a review of what went well in terms of the approach by the security agencies, what didn't go well, what lessons have been learned, so that there will be other protests. I'm hoping nothing as major as that, but it's very likely there will be other protests. Are we still going to approach it in the manner that we approached the last one, or are we going to use those lessons learned to approach it better? I've given some tips, but there's still a lot more that I think we can do in terms of improving both the intelligence collection ahead of the protest and then the types of deployment. One of the things that I think we can also improve upon is the equipment repository for our, especially police, in managing protest. Cordoning of protesters requires unique equipment in modern day protest. You don't use the type of force, but you can cordon them off psychologically using technology. And because it's a public space, I'm very conscious of what I'm saying, but there is technology out there. And this is not even sophisticated technology, equipment that you can use in cordoning off protesters so that the route they pass are routes that are cordoned off, and then you reduce infiltration. You also reduce the possibility that they can now go and destroy public property because you've already cordoned the route and you provided that. So these are some of the errors or mistakes that I saw in terms of the handling and that we've documented in that report.
All right. So still about the notable developments in September 2024, which you highlighted in your report. You mentioned the heightened military operations observed in the Northwest region that led to the death of key bandit leaders and the establishment of a joint military theater operation and the reception of T-129 helicopters from Turkey to enhance counterinsurgency efforts. So for you, it reflects, according to that report, it reflects the federal government's commitment to tackle security issues. Is this confirming that concerted efforts by governments are yielding the desired results?
We're not in doubt that the federal government is committed to addressing the security challenges, but commitment and results are two different things. I started this conversation by saying that as far as we are concerned and as far as we know, there is no strategy that would allow the measurement of success. Security can never be implemented in a vacuum. When we had a challenge in the Northeast, we quickly developed a national counterterrorism strategy. I asked the big question, what is our strategy for addressing the banditry challenge in the Northwest, North Central Nigeria? So this, I think, is the major challenge. The commitment is there, and I must give the Bola Tinubu Ahmed administration significant kudos. If you pick the Renewed Hope agenda, there are several elements, about 8 of them, that speaks to security. With reference to your question, the one that comes to my mind is the promise that security strategies will be developed for each of the geopolitical regions. I would have thought that the coordinators of our national security structure would have worked within the last 1 year plus to develop these strategies for each of the geopolitical regions, because there are different security threat elements in each of the geopolitical regions, so that those strategies will form the basis for coordination, for cooperation, and for collaboration between our security agencies. And I'm sorry to say, just like I said at the beginning, we haven't seen those strategies in place at the moment. And it's only when we have those strategies that we'll be able to measure meaningful success. At the moment, one of the things that pains me, and it's really the absence of those strategies. The federal government, in some instances, have positions that are in contradiction with what the state governments have in terms of approach to security. Meanwhile, our enemy, the threat elements, are united in terms of their desire to wield violence to us. But our government, the federal and state government, are not united in terms of that.
So, Dr. Adamu, I asked the question because you also mentioned other events reflecting an evolving legislative framework in ways that support the aspirations of the populace for more effective state governance structures and an inclusive and stable political environment. Just today, the federal government's commitment to strengthening Nigeria's military capabilities through improved research and development has been reiterated by Minister of Defense, Mohammed Badaru. So how do we enhance and strengthen this aspect of our operations?
Let's quickly develop a broad strategy for each of the threat elements that we have. And there are not so many. There are 3, I think, at the moment that are disturbing a lot of Nigerians. Number 1 is the banditry. Let's quickly have a broad strategy, a framework for addressing the banditry challenge. That framework, that strategy should look at the pull factors. Why are we seeing more young people getting involved in the banditry challenge? Why are we seeing groups challenging the supremacy of the use of force by the state? That strategy should be able to have mitigation measures embedded within them to reduce recruitment, to reduce funding, to reduce the equipment acquisition by these groups, to reduce the support that they're getting from within the ecospace where they operate. It will also allow the 3 levels of government to key in and you work in unison. And then more importantly, it will also allow the implementers to get the buy-in of the local populace at the end of the day. That for me is number 1. Number 2 is oil theft. Our economy is dependent of, I think, almost about 37 or 38% our GDP on oil. And at the moment, our economy is bleeding because we're unable to even meet our both local demands and then the OPEC quota that would have gotten us the revenue for the economy to function. Just yesterday, OPEC did say that we're at 1.32 million barrels instead of the 2.2, I think, that we've been given as a country. And, we can't continue like that. We need to call a spade, and where changes are required to ensure that the effectiveness and the efficiency of this military security strategy that we have for stopping oil theft is achieved, then we need to do that. Otherwise, our economy will continue to bleed. You and I are suffering from that bleeding economy. I can't even say enough about that. Then number 3 is kidnapping. This is something that is worrying every Nigerian. People, can't travel freely. loved ones have been abducted, they have to pay ransom, and some people are shocked that some of the perpetrators actually go on social media to brag about the monies they've collected. So we need a grand strategy, a broad strategy on anti-kidnapping that would bring both the federal and state governments together, and of course strengthen law enforcement to ensure that banditry, kidnapping in particular, is brought to an end. I think these three things. The other ones, I think we already have strategies on them, like terrorism. I mentioned that we have a national counterterrorism strategy, which is in place. But for all of these other ones, I haven't seen really a strategy,
all right,
codified one that would help us in addressing them.